Welcome back to the Makers of MidCity podcast. Today we have the opportunity to sit down with Rob Robinson, Master Planner and Principal of Urban Design Associates.
And I'm Nadia Niakasari, the Director of Development for RCP Companies.
Awesome. Well, Rob, would you like to introduce yourself and kind of give us a little bit about your background?
Well, sure. I've been the chairman of Urban Design Associates for about 15 years, and I joined that group almost 30 years ago. So we've been working in cities and towns and rural countryside in the U.S. and around the world for most of my career. So it's been a lot of fun, been really interesting. Everything changes, context and scale of project. And working here in MidCity has been really a highlight for my career and the way UDA works. So we've known RCP for probably 25 years before it was RCP. And now to see it, the MidCity emerge has been really interesting for us because we're all sort of living, what was once only a drawing on paper. So it's challenging all the time, but also incredibly inspirational. And this is a great team.
Yeah. So what was the first introduction into RCP, and kind of how did the whole planning for MidCity even begin? Because I mean, it's a 15-year process or more just to kind of create what even we see today, even though we're only a third of the way through.
That's right. Well, it was a departure for the conventional kind of commercial development that RCP had practiced before. And I think the genesis of MidCity was also an idea about RCP becoming a very different kind of real estate company and thinking more about what is this place that we want to live in, work in, be in, and how do we bring different uses together to create whole environments. So that's a big concept, tall order, really difficult to do, but you got to start somewhere. And the opportunity here was really presented to RCP with the city of Huntsville to take a dying mall, or essentially a dead mall, that we have all around this country now, and transform it into a piece of city building. Not easy, because nothing is wired to be a city around it. It's much more suburban. Uses are spread out. It's typically segregated uses, offices over here, food over here, housing over here, and it's completely automobile dominated. So when I got the call from RCP to take a look at this and think about how we could do this differently, we understood the problem of how do you make great urbanism, great places for people, but in a context where it doesn't really exist immediately around you. You've got downtown Huntsville, and many of the little downtowns in this region that serve as great prototypes, but that's not what we inherited. We inherited 100 plus acres of parking lot and giant building. So thinking about it, rethinking, how this could evolve over time, we find really involves stopping, getting everybody who's involved, including the city and all the businesses that are around here and the politics behind how do you change the mindset of the way a city's building itself or rebuilding itself, and beginning to develop a story about what this place could be. And you have to do that, we find, you have to do that early on. And it's more about a conversation of where do we want to go here? What do we want to be when we grow up? And how do we get there? Those are the sort of fundamental questions. And RCP had already taken a few runs at the site, thinking about, what would we do here? And when we got the call, it was kind of ready for the next stage. Like, how do we really do this? How's it going to work? And
how do you lay out that grid, the grid that you've created at MidCity? I think is really interesting part of all of this too. Like, Rob, I've learned a lot from you in the last 7 years that we've been working together, and it's been a pleasure just absorbing all the knowledge that you bring, because you've designed cities all over the world, and down from Nashville. We were in Nashville just yesterday, from downtown Nashville's master plan to, you were joking about how many times you've designed the city of Riyadh. You've done 4 different plans for Riyadh and Moscow and all these cities. So what do you find is those are the core principles of when you have a large area like this 140-acre master plan of MidCity? How do you lay out how do you lay out the grid that is these 18 city blocks? What are the core principles behind the master planning of a large dirt field?
Yeah, good question, because it's always different. Depending on where you are and what the context is.
Mm-hmm.
So I can remember pretty clearly starting here, and we get all the mapping, right? You start with the basics, and you sort of see what's around you, what's happening, and how is this place growing.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Huntsville was particularly challenging because things were happening fast here, and they still are. And so you get a lot of Nashville, for instance, you just talked about, same way. We knew it was on the edge of explosive growth, like so many southeastern cities are. You take a Nashville, you take a Charlotte, you take a Huntsville, different scales, different context. So the grid's not always the same, right? And it's not always a grid, which is very interesting. You tend to default to city grids because that's how our country grew. We were orthogonally planned in a lot of places. And then it grew from there. It grew more organically. Here, finding what the form wanted to be was a bit of a treasure hunt, right? And when you look at MidCity, we're on the outskirts of the downtown. So we don't have any context grid to work with. And a lot of times when we're in places, we look to see what is the inherited pattern. So, for instance, if you come from my city in Pittsburgh, we have tiny grid downtown. Tiny. Streets are narrow. You can walk from one end of the block to the other in, less than a minute. Other cities, the grids are much bigger. Spatially, it's just a very different feeling. So trying to find, where we wanted to be, in Huntsville, what's Huntsville, and what does this region want to feel like, was a process of discovery. Because when we looked at the mapping, there were no clues here. A lot of times you get clues, nothing here, because it was a mall, right? And around us was highway-related development. So we get that. American cities that's what's happened to us. And this idea of creating a walkable environment that's humane in scale, where people get to see each other, it's a 24-hour thing. It's not just let's come shop, get in our car, drive back to where we live. It's more, I think the aspiration was more about how do we create a place, and RCP, you guys love to use this word, and I think it's a really great technical word, sticky, right? That's a Max word. How do you make a place where you just gravitate here? And that's hard. That's not like a designer thing so much, or a master planner thing. How do I make a sticky place? Like, what are you talking about? So thinking about that first idea of how do we create a nucleus and then grow it in this region. So, and that's a big deal. And because you can be an isolated island, those typically don't do so well after a while, because they're not really connected to anything else. And I think what gave us a lot of hope here is that we had the conversation with RCP and with the city of Huntsville that we need to make a polycentric city here. You guys are growing. It's spreading out like peanut butter everywhere. Time out. Can we have a place that, you can do more in? It can be much more diverse and contain many more moments than just a trip to the store. And to do that, the city really had to agree to really change their mindset, because we wanted to be tethered to other great places in Huntsville without necessarily having to get in a car. Big challenge here. So a lot of the discussions were, how do we tether this back to downtown, to areas that are growing? And then what's the pattern going to be as you move forward? We're sitting in the middle of a giant research park. good luck getting from one building to the next, right? That was a whole different mindset about what those environments were supposed to be. And now that's changing, to where people don't want to get in the car except for every trip to go get a stick of gum down the street or
Yeah,
uh,
walkability. Walkability is so important in districts like
yeah.
this. Mhm.
And so to think about that, you start thinking about what is that, you call it the grid. What is that grid pattern? What's going to be the framework to allow this to grow? So it was one thing to think about block sizes and, how that really works in cities. And in your historic downtown, you have tiny little grid of streets, which, is charming. And it gets you a lot of building frontage, and places are much more accessible. So we looked at that a lot. And then we also realized that we're in a completely different realm of building cities these days. The buildings tend to be much larger than they were in the past.
Especially in footprint. I feel like the
In
footprint
footprint,
is,
big
instead
time.
of like building one footprint up, you're building out. Especially in a market like Huntsville, where you have all the space to build outwards rather than up.
Yeah, and sometimes you're building a block at a time.
Right.
Really hard, in different ways. We can talk about that in a little bit. But so we've got this increment of building that we know is going to be, for the most part, a much larger object than you would have encountered in the 19th century or early 20th century. It just is. And so that was a challenge here, because when we started, the Huntsville market wasn't hadn't matured enough to think about more density within a built project. So parking, for instance, what's really going to drive most of these projects is parking. And we always say, and if you all you got to do is first understand the size of the parking requirement for that building that you're designing or that block that you're making, and then you start. And then you
Mhm.
start to understand what it is you have to contend with. When we started this, uh, we didn't expect that it could support what we would call structured parking, where the parking footprint shrinks and becomes invisible to the public realm when you're here walking around. That happened for us fairly early, about maybe 2 years into the project. We realized that, well, hang on here. We're growing so fast. We need to actually be out in front of this market a little bit, and to think about walkability and what it feels like to be on a mid-city street. The last thing you want to do is walk around a giant parking lot and find your way to the front door. So here we had to size blocks to be able to accommodate that. And so when we first started looking at a pattern of streets and public spaces that were walkable and could make a great place, we had to think about, okay, how will this grow over time? How
Mhm.
can we, you know, set this pattern so that we're building great frontages along each street with the buildings, and not creating these giant gaps where I've got to walk across a football field.
Massive parking lots in front of your buildings. Instead, and you'll see this at like the building that we're sitting in right now, Metronome. Metronome, the building kind of is built around the parking structure, so that you don't have like kind of like how Research Park is built. It's this massive building, massive parking lot next to another massive parking lot with a massive building, and it doesn't make for a nice
Yeah.
environment that people want to like be able to walk in
Yeah.
and around.
As
Yeah, it's really hard to
yeah.
get any kind of critical mass of thinking that you're, within a district or within a little precinct, because you never get the chance, to touch the next building because it's way over there, because you're
Right.
separated by parking. So that's a big challenge for any project, to get your arms around how we're going to handle this.
Hmm.
What are we going to do? Because there are different ways to do it, and you see it in cities as they evolve. Sometimes you can do big buildings like this, but sometimes you can't. You're going underground, or you're parking up in the building,
Right.
if it's a mature place. And I expect we'll see all of that here
Yeah.
Yeah.
How has the planning for MidCity as MidCity's been able to grow and as new things are being added? I would assume just as the plan gets first introduced, you're having to kind of reintroduce it and change things that work best for the community and work best for the district, as well as seeing what's happening in the Huntsville community elsewhere too. Because like you said, you were beginning this project at a time that Huntsville's market was booming too, and Huntsville's continuing to grow in other areas. How does that impact the work being done in the planning for MidCity or for a district in general?
Good question. Particularly when we're involved in a scale of a project that's going to take more than a decade, right? So, because your crystal ball only gets you so far, as you say, you don't understand what are the, new elements that could come in that are really going to rock your world. And has that ever been the case here? Because it's something happening, like it feels like almost every month that you didn't see happening before. And I think that's actually the beauty of creating great urban environments, because it's really just a receiver for different uses. So you kind of have to look at what you're trying to achieve in an overall sense of place, and then when new things come in, how do you respond? So we're fortunate because the team has been able to respond to new opportunities that were not even on the horizon, but not lose the mission of creating a genuinely authentic place, which is really difficult to do.
Hard to make places sticky, right?
Places sticky.
Got to make them sticky.
Yeah. Right. And then, sort of stay true to your vision and mission. And I would say that element of MidCity has been one of the strongest that we've ever worked with, where everyone on this team is really focused on the nuances of what it feels like to be in this space and what's happening in that little park and how's it going to live day to day. And when it fills with events and concerts, how does that change the dynamic, and how do you balance those uses? So it is like a constant, churn of how do we make this work? How can we make this better? How can this place feel like it's always been here, like that you belong here, and it's for everyone. Those are much more important than building design and layout and that sort of thing. Because if you don't have that sort of heartfelt, true mission about what you're doing, then sometimes anything goes, right? Oh, here's an opportunity, and that so often happens, and something pops up over here, something pops up over there. And if you don't give it the same love and attention, that you started out with, then it tends to take its own course. So those elements here, I think, are really strong. Nadia's team and, the day-to-day thinking about what's this going to be like for folks, and how do we...
Well, that's one of my favorite part of our process, right? The process that you taught us of the design charrette, right? Every project here at MidCity starts with a design charrette, and this is a UDA specialty of how they get started on a project, whether that's just one building, whether that's one building in one block, or whether it's the entire district or sub-district. We always start by getting all of the stakeholders involved in that building or block or district in a room. And that includes the experts of whatever realm, like whether it's like a residential project or a music venue or like a restaurant. Then you get the food and bev experts in the room, and you start talking about okay, what do we want this to be? Where and how do we want to design it? And then Rob and his team, as we're talking, as everybody is discovering what this project will be, Rob and his team are sitting there drawing. And by the end of the design charrette, we'll have our first rendering of what that project is. And it's a really special process because you have all the experts in the room, which is my favorite part because everybody's an expert in their own field. And so everybody brings something very special to the room. And talk a little bit about the design charrette process and
Yeah, you're right. It's fun to
It's a
actually
fun
think about
process.
how much of that we've done here.
How many design charrettes we've done now.
9 times out of 10 when we do design charrettes, there's somebody already living there. It's somebody's
Mhm.
neighborhood,
Right.
somebody's city, somebody's town. And we started our practice that way in 1964. Most cities in the U.S. were in big trouble, right? Riots in the streets, a lot of social unrest, a lot of people feeling disenfranchised from what was happening in their cities. And so we started with conversations with people before you call in the expert to say, here's a plan. What do you think? It's like, what's going on here? What's important to you? What's missing? What, you know, what do you need to be connected to? What's not here now that needs to be here? And you just start asking questions because we don't know. We know what we do, but we don't know your town. We don't know your neighborhood. We don't know your aspirations. And I bet you haven't heard your neighbor express their aspirations. And it's really powerful tool when people come together and it's not us saying you should do this, but somebody says, "Well, what about this? I don't have any place where I can take my child to a park during the day. It's way across town, or where do I walk my dog, or where can I, you know, find a small little apartment to live in, or a little cottage, or a place to work, whatever it is." And you've got to tie those threads together, document it, understand where there are shared visions for what you want to be when you grow up, and then what are the differences, and then how do you celebrate those differences? How do you balance that? And we've sort of evolved as I always call us we're like a traveling theater group. We show up, we do our work in teams, and everyone on the team, from somebody who's hasn't been working at UDA for very long or just out of university or who's come to us, to the principals, where we always approach it together because everybody needs to hear everything, because you may hear something different. You may have a conversation on the side of the room that's pivotal and changes the whole way you think about something. And all of us contribute to that. And so when we were first named as Urban Design Associates, really from my predecessor, David Lewis, he saw it as everybody's an urban design associate. So we can never do this in isolation. Architects tend to work in isolation. We're all architects by training. Um, and that it's less about that, and it's more about, you know, how does this reflect? How does this become a mirror? Because everyone where you live is also a reflection on the image of yourself and the way you feel. And when you realize how important that is, then you look to things that are common between people, and you also want to celebrate those differences, and that's really different than just designing a building or designing a little neighborhood or a district. So it infuses the way we think, and we realized that the best way for us to do that was just start drawing early. And so we still do traditional media. We do computer, of course, digital media all the time. But there's nothing more disarming than sitting at a table with somebody who's drawing your future place. And there's no separation between what that person thinks they're drawing and what you see. So being able to come by any of our tables, we sort of travel with the studio. We do all of our work in place. Uh, and then we come back and test it again. And people can tell us if a drawing is looking like what's in their head, or what everybody's been talking about, and they can tell you when you're wrong. And we love it because we use it as a way to talk.
It's such a special
language.
moment when because Rob is awesome, and Rob's team is awesome. I mean, everybody who works with MidCity at Urban Design Associates, from Ashley and Lily to Jeffrey, it's such a special moment because they don't get to come to Huntsville as often, and so when they come here, they're now walking around and through buildings that they designed sometimes 2, 3, 4 years ago. And it's such a special moment for that architect to be able to put hands and feet on something that they they were inspired by 3, 4 years ago. It'd be really interesting. I'd love to show you, or if we can somehow link it to this, or overlay this, some of the drawings.
Oh yeah, that would be
especially
fun.
like buildings that are now open, like the Blue Oak building is now open. So we'll pull up a photo, the illustration that Dave did back in 2019, 2020, something like that.
2019 for that.
Yeah. And now it's open, and how they look, how similar they look from a drawing that was done 4 or 5 years ago.
I think that's the unique. I mean, we had someone on the podcast talking, the graphic designer Brian Manley that does the graphic design work for MidCity, and he said one of his coolest moments for him as a designer too is when you see your design in public. Like it's the shirt you design and someone's wearing it at a concert. It's the poster you designed for an event and he's out in Huntsville, which he's not here that often either. And they're like, it's in his hotel room. It's in like those moments are just super unique. Thinking back when you first did your drawings and then now being here and seeing it, I mean, obviously there's so much that's happened since, but there's so much more that you've probably designed that's still, 3 to 5 to 10 years away from happening. What's that moment like as you travel the world and you design these places all over the world, all across the Southeast, everywhere, and you get to now visit places like MidCity and see it actually happening?
Yeah, it's mixed. Right, it's mixed. A lot of times in our work, when we're as urban designers, we'll come into cities. Well, let's just take Nashville. And we'll spend a year, 2 years there, working on, for Nashville, it was the Sobro district, which was also part of a flood mitigation project along the river, part of the city that was never really utilized because it always flooded. And when you resolve those problems, there's an environmental issue that, you're having to address fundamentally. And then there's placemaking. And then there's a city that's growing like crazy. But Nashville really, other than the Music Row and the Broadway corridor, never really had a sort of soul in it as a downtown. So when you're thinking about that and you're going through a process and people are asking for that, where is that moment in our city? And you do your design work, and we produce a master plan and all the drawings and the design, and then you go away. And then maybe you come back 5 years later, 10 years later, 2 years later. It just depends, city by city. And you see what happened. And it's like, sometimes it's like, wow, this is amazing. And then sometimes it's like, what went on here? What happened here? It's like you weren't there for the whole birthing process. You come back and you visit it like an uncle. And you see, you see your niece born, and then you come back and she's going to college. So it's really different. It's, this stuff can be done to satisfy an ego. Plenty of egos to go around in our business. For us, we like to make sure that we're invisible. So when you come into a place that we've worked on, we don't want you to say, "Oh, yeah, that's a UDA project over there," as a signature. So it all comes back to back to you. It's more about, I see a kid sitting on a hay bale listening to music and eating food out of a camp truck, and they're talking to somebody that's completely different than they are, and they would have never had that moment unless that place had been there. For me, that's the top of the heap.
Wow.
Right? It's not how beautiful is that building and look at that view. Those are all important things, but it's that for us, it's that human interaction where people feel like they belong and do belong. Then that's a great moment when you can see that those spaces worked out that way and the scale was pretty good. And, if you had it to do over again, you might. You always do everything different. Here, you don't have to wait that long to do it over again. In MidCity, we
have multiple opportunities to get
constant.
it right.
So you can't go, this is a perfect design. And this often happens, right? Because you pour your heart and soul into it, only to wad up the paper and start again because something changed. And it is a difference in our business. You have to be able to do that.
How many times have we redesigned this block just to the south of us? This
or
block
this
13, or this little park.
Park, or this building.
Oh, yeah.
No.
So you're always, if your mind is in that mode where you can't fall in love with yourself or your creation so much that you resist change, and that's very hard. That's very hard it's not always the way an architect thinks. But man, when you jump scale and you're into designing cities or districts in cities, if you don't have that, you're going to miss so much. It might have been a beautiful, perfect looking design, and and somehow that never happens.
Yeah.
So that's been a lifelong lesson. But it's always one that I enjoy, because you never know where the next idea is coming from. These ideas can come from anybody. And this RCP team, they have 1,000 ideas. And it's fabulous because you're always sort of looking for
you're always having to like pivot a little bit and
all the time.
And you just never know what's going to happen. I think the comment you made about seeing people that would never be talking to each other, communicating with each other, having conversations, enjoying a drink with each other, but getting to do that in a district like MidCity, I think is that activating of the district and the engagement of the community that's bought into what's happening here and is going to continue to buy in over the years. I mean, like you said, we're a third of the way through and there's still quite a bit to happen. And then this district, and we had it on previous episodes, we talked about it's going to get to the point, and it might be even to that point in some cases, that you might not ever have to drive. Everything you need is within walkable. It's within touch. Like you can just get out of your apartment at the Metronome, and you can walk to get groceries. You can walk to have a concert. You can walk to whatever. But it's incredible to just see and hear the story of from drawing it on paper to then now seeing it today. But it's been fun having you on. I mean, I've enjoyed it immensely. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the podcast, and we'll have all the information, any links of anything that we've talked about in the episode notes or the description of the video, so you can find out more information there about Rob and the work he does at UDA. But I appreciate it.
Sure thing.
Thank you,
Enjoyed
Rob.
talking about it. Thanks, Nadia. Thanks, Clark.